The stagecoach to Redvale was scheduled to leave Black Ridge at 2:30, and by quarter after, most of the town already knew there would be one more passenger on it than had been planned. Clara Bennett had arrived in Black Ridge 11 days ago with 40 cents, a canvas bag that held everything she owned, and a kind of quiet desperation she had learned over many years to wear like an ordinary face. She had found work quickly enough, dishwashing at Grady's meal house, then a few days of mending for the Hollis family on the east end of town. And for a brief, foolish stretch of time, she had believed that Black Ridge might be different from the last town, and the one before that. She had believed she might actually manage to stay. She had been wrong. The debt was $3.20, owed to Virgil Oates at the dry goods counter. Oates was not a cruel man exactly, but he was a careful one, and careful men in frontier towns had a habit of turning brittle when money was involved. Clara had asked for credit on a small parcel of sugar and salt the previous week, explaining that her wages from Grady were coming on Friday. Oates had agreed. Then Grady had cut her hours without warning, and Friday's wages had not covered what she owed, and now it was market day, the one day every week when half the county came into town, and Virgil Oates had decided that the most efficient way to handle the situation was to handle it publicly. $3.20, he announced from behind his counter, in a voice that carried easily across the market square. I've extended credit in good faith, and I'll not extend it further. Clara stood at the counter with her canvas bag at her feet and a small paper parcel in her hands. Around her, the market square was full and noisy. Farmers with wagons, ranch wives with baskets, children running between legs, and every single one of them, it seemed, had stopped what they were doing to listen. I can work it off, she said. She kept her voice even. She had a lot of practice keeping her voice even. I'm a good seamstress. I can give you $3 worth of work before the week is out. I don't need a seamstress. I can do whatever you need. Inventory, cleaning, anything. Oates shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he has already made up his mind and is merely going through the motions of a conversation. I need my $3.20, Miss Bennett, same as I told you last week. There was a murmur in the crowd, not unsympathetic exactly, just the sound of people reminding each other of what they already believed about young women alone in frontier towns, that they were trouble, that this kind of thing happened. Standing a few feet away, pretending to examine a bolt of calico, Martha Pierce absorbed every word with the focused attention of a woman who considered public information to be a personal resource. Martha was 53 years old, thick-waisted, sharp-eyed, and had lived in Black Ridge longer than most of the buildings. She knew the name and business of every person in the county, and she had already formed a complete opinion of Clara Bennett on the girl's second day in town. Nothing she was currently witnessing was changing it. Sheriff Nolan came over, not to help, but because disorder of any kind on market day was bad for business, and a public argument at the dry goods counter qualified as disorder. What's the trouble, Virgil? No trouble, Oates said, just letting Miss Bennett know that she'll be needing to settle her account today, or we'll have to come to some other arrangement. What other arrangement? Clara asked. The stagecoach to Redvale departs at 2:30, Oates said. I'll consider the debt forgiven if you're on it. The square went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something uncomfortable is said plainly in front of everyone. Clara looked at the man for a long moment. $3.20. She had not eaten breakfast that morning. Her last real meal had been the previous afternoon. Half a plate of beans she had worked 2 hours for at the Grady place. She was 24 years old, and she had been in situations like this more times than she could easily count. And the thing she had learned, the hard lesson that had taken years to learn properly, was that arguing did not help. Arguing made them dig in. It made them feel that their position required defending, and men who felt their positions required defending became immovable. She did not argue. She picked up her canvas bag and stepped back from the counter, and the crowd parted around her without much discussion, because crowds are efficient that way. She had until 2:30. She stood in the middle of the market square and did the only kind of thinking she knew how to do when options were few, practical thinking. Not why is this happening or what did I do wrong, but what is actually available to me in the next 2 hours. She could go back to Grady and ask for an advance. She had already asked once and been told no. She could try the Hollis family. She had finished their mending, they had no more work for her. She could ask someone outright for $3. She had learned in a long sequence of towns that asking strangers for money rarely ended the way you hoped, and that it cost something each time you tried, something that didn't grow back easily. She was still standing there, going through the diminishing list in her head, when she heard the horse. It was a roan mare tied to a post outside the harness shop, one of a dozen horses tied along the street, all of them standing peacefully in the market day noise until a freight wagon came around the corner too fast and too loud and clipped a rain barrel, which hit a crate, which skittered across the ground directly under the roan's feet. The mare exploded sideways. She was tied, so she couldn't run, but panic doesn't require running. The horse reared, came down hard, reared again, yanking against the hitching post with a force that shook the whole rail. Tied to the saddle, bouncing and slipping, was a saddlebag that none of the watching adults had noticed. And sitting in the middle of that saddlebag, somehow, impossibly, was a small girl. Later, no one could quite explain how she had gotten there. She was perhaps 5 years old, small even for that, and she had apparently climbed up and gotten herself wedged between the saddlebag and the cantle in some game that had made perfect sense to a 5-year-old and made no sense at all to any adult observing it now. She was screaming. The horse was screaming too, in its own way, hooves striking the boardwalk, body slamming sideways, the hitching rail beginning to crack at the base. People froze. That's the honest thing to say about it. The market square was full of adults, and most of them froze, because the horse was large and panicked, and there was no obvious safe approach, and the gap between seeing a problem and knowing what to do about it is wider than people like to admit. Clara was already moving. She didn't run directly at the horse. She came in from the side, which was the only sensible direction. Not in front of where the hooves were striking, not behind where a kick could take her head off, but from the left flank, which was the side the horse was consistently shying away from, which meant it was the one spot where the animal, in its panic, was not actively attacking. She moved quietly. Not slowly. She had perhaps 4 seconds before the hitching rail gave, but without the kind of sudden noise that would make the horse worse. She got her hand on the horse's neck, put pressure there, steady, firm, not gripping. "Hey," she said, not loud. "Hey." "Easy." The horse jerked, came down from its rear, turned its head toward her. Its eye was still white-rimmed and wild, but it had registered the contact. And contact, for a horse, is something to focus on. "Easy," Clara said again, and she kept her hand on the neck and her body still, and she was terrified. She was genuinely and completely terrified, and her legs were not steady, and her hand was shaking against the animal's coat, but she did not show any of that, because showing it would not help. The horse shuddered, tossed its head once, did not rear again. Clara reached up and took the little girl off the saddle in one clean motion. The child was light as a bundle of rags, still crying, arms immediately wrapping around Clara's neck. And then she stepped back from the horse, and the horse stood there, blowing hard, sides heaving, but standing. The square was very quiet. Then several people started talking at once, and the noise came rushing back, and someone took the little girl from Clara's arms and Clara's legs, now that it was over, decided to demonstrate just how much they had been involved in the whole event by shaking noticeably. She sat down on the edge of the boardwalk, not gracefully. She just sat down because standing was briefly beyond her. "Lucy." The voice came from the far end of the square, moving fast. A man in his mid-30s, tall, with sun-weathered skin, and the particular kind of walk that belongs to people who spend most of their time outdoors and are not, at this moment, wasting any of it. He crossed the square in long strides and dropped to one knee in front of the child, running his hands over her in the systematic way of someone checking for injury, his face doing something complicated that was part relief and part the specific fury of a parent who has just experienced several of the worst seconds of their life. "She's all right," said the woman holding Lucy. "She's frightened, but she's all right." "She climbed up herself," someone offered helpfully. "We didn't see her until the mare spooked." The man, Ethan Calloway, though Clara didn't know that yet, pulled his daughter into his arms and held her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked up, scanning the crowd with the particular focused look of someone who has a follow-up question and intends to get an answer. "Who got her off?" There was a beat of silence, and then several people looked toward Clara, who was still sitting on the boardwalk edge looking somewhat less than heroic. Ethan Calloway stood up, Lucy still in his arms, and looked at the young woman on the boardwalk. She was slight. That was the first thing you noticed, how slight she was. Her dress clean but worn thin at the elbows, her canvas bag beside her like a small, faithful animal. She looked up at him with dark eyes that were completely composed, which surprised him because most people who had just done something frightening looked either proud or shaken, and she looked like neither. "That was you," he said. "The horse just needed something to focus on," Clara said. "She wasn't mean, she was scared." He looked at her for another moment, then he said, "What's your name?" "Clara Bennett." Standing nearby, Martha Pierce watched this exchange with the expression of a woman filing information away. Ethan shifted Lucy to one arm and extended his free hand, and Clara shook it, because what else do you do when a man extends his hand? His grip was firm and brief and businesslike. "Ethan Calloway," he said, "I owe you." "You don't," Clara said. The horse did most of the work. Lucy, from the safety of her father's arms, had stopped crying and was now studying Clara with the direct, evaluating attention that 5-year-olds apply to anything that interests them. "You're skinny," she said. "Lucy," Ethan said. "I am," Clara agreed. "Did the horse hurt you?" "No." "Your hands are shaking." "They'll stop in a minute." Ethan looked at her, not the pitying look, not the assessing look, but something more direct than either. Then he said, "I heard what Oates was saying earlier." Clara's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. "It's being handled," she said. "How?" "I'm working on it." "You've got—" He glanced toward the clock above the assay office. "About an hour and 40 minutes. "I'm aware of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much?" $3.20. He didn't react to the amount, didn't make the face people made when they were deciding whether a number was large enough to matter. He just said, "Wait here," handed Lucy to the woman beside him, and walked toward Oates's dry goods counter. Clara watched him go. She sat very still on the boardwalk edge because her legs were still not fully her own yet, and she watched Ethan Calloway walk up to Virgil Oates and say something, and Oates say something back, and Ethan put money on the counter, and Oates look at it. Martha Pierce materialized at Clara's elbow. "That's Ethan Calloway," she said, in the tone of a woman who considers information a form of currency. "Runs the Calloway spread out on Pinto Creek. Widower. 2 daughters. The little one you just saved and an older girl, Rose, 13 or so." "All right," Clara said. "He's had a hard 2 years. His wife passed, fever, and he's been fighting a custody case ever since, if you can believe it. Wife's family down in Garnet thinks the girls should be raised in town." Martha paused. "He doesn't have much help out there. Used to hire a housekeeper, but that ended when the money got tight." Clara looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Martha's eyes were small and sharp and not unkind exactly. More like the eyes of someone who is kind only when it costs them nothing. "Just making conversation," she said. Ethan came back. He did not look particularly pleased about what he had just done, but he did not look like a man performing charity either. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was committed to it. "Debt settled," he said. Clara stood up. Her legs worked fine now. "Mr. Calloway, you need work?" She paused. "Yes?" "I've got a ranch that needs more hands than I currently have," he said. "It's not easy work and I can't pay much, but there's room and meals, and it's honest. Why are you offering me this?" He looked at her steadily. "Because my daughter is standing behind me, and I don't owe an explanation to anyone here except her," he said, "and because you have a particular skill with frightened animals that I could use." It was not a romantic offer. It was not a generous offer, exactly. It was a practical one, and that, Clara understood. Practical was the only language she had ever fully trusted. "All right," she said. Lucy appeared from behind her father's leg and looked up at Clara with great seriousness. "Are you coming to our house?" "Looks like it." "Good," Lucy said. "Rose is going to say you can't stay." "Lucy," Ethan said. "She says that about everyone." The wagon was a working ranch wagon, one rear axle louder than the other, the seat worn smooth in 2 particular spots, a collection of tools and rope and empty feed sacks in the back. Clara sat beside Ethan on the bench and Lucy sat between them, which had apparently been decided entirely by Lucy. The market square of Black Ridge fell away behind them. Clara looked back once. Virgil Oates was watching from his doorway. Martha Pierce was talking to someone near the fabric stall, her mouth moving in the particular rapid way of a woman who has a lot to say and is in a hurry to say it. The wagon turned onto the Pinto Creek Road, and the town disappeared behind a rise of scrub oak, and Clara faced forward and watched the country open up. The flat grass, the thin tree line along the creek, the sky very large and the clouds moving slowly from west to east, like they had somewhere to be and were not particularly worried about getting there. She did not let herself think about what she was riding toward. She had learned not to do that too early. Early hope was the most expensive kind. The Callaway Ranch came into view after about 40 minutes. First the fence line, then the barn, then the house itself, two-story, wood frame, with a covered porch running along the front. It was not a prosperous-looking place. The paint was wearing off the south side of the house in long strips, and one of the porch railings was missing, and the kitchen garden beside the house was more weeds than plants. But it was solid. The bones of it were solid. Ethan pulled up in front of the barn, and that's when the door of the house opened and Rose appeared. She was 13 and tall for it, with her father's coloring and an expression that she had clearly been working on for some time, the expression of someone who has decided to be suspicious of everything as a default setting and intends to stick to it. She looked at Clara on the wagon seat. She looked at her father. She looked back at Clara. "Who's that?" she said. Not quite a question. "This is Miss Clara Bennett," Ethan said, climbing down. "She's going to be helping out around the place for a while." "We don't need help." "Rose, we've been doing fine." "Rose," Ethan said, in a tone that was not angry but was fully finished with the conversation, "take your sister inside and wash up for supper." Rose held her position for a moment, long enough to make a point without crossing a line, then came off the porch, took Lucy's hand with the practiced efficiency of an older sister who has done this 1,000 times, and went back inside. At the door she stopped and looked at Clara once more. Clara met her eyes and did not look away and did not smile. She just looked back, steady and direct, the way she had looked at the horse. Rose went inside. Clara climbed down from the wagon with her canvas bag and stood in the yard of the Callaway Ranch and looked at the house and the weeds and the peeling paint and the evening coming in low and orange over the hills to the west. Somewhere in the house, Lucy was talking. She could hear the girl's voice, high and quick, telling Rose something that required considerable volume and enthusiasm. A ranch that was failing, a widower who looked like he had forgotten how to sleep, a teenager who didn't want her there, a 5-year-old who had decided in the space of 40 minutes that they were friends. Clara had started over in worse places. She couldn't think of one at the moment, but she was fairly certain they existed. She went to find the kitchen. It was smaller inside than the outside suggested, which was common in ranch houses. The ceilings close, the rooms functional, not 1 inch wasted on anything that didn't work. The kitchen was in the back, and it was in a state that suggested that whoever had last been responsible for it had either left suddenly or simply given up. The stove needed blacking. The shelves held enough food for perhaps 3 days if you were careful about portions and not being hungry. A window over the dry sink had a crack in the glass that had been patched with oilcloth but had not been properly fixed, and the evening draft was already coming through it in a way that said winter is not far, and this window knows it. Clara set her bag on the floor and opened it, and took out what she had: a change of clothes, a small sewing kit and a tobacco tin, a bone-handled pocket knife, and 43 cents. Not $3.20 anymore, just 43 cents. She put the money in her apron pocket and looked at the kitchen. The stove first. You couldn't do anything else without the stove. She found coal in a bin behind the barn and spent 20 minutes getting the stove lit. It was temperamental, with a flue damper that stuck, and she burned her fingers on it twice. And by the time Ethan came in from putting up the horses, there was a fire going and water on to heat, and Clara was going through the shelves with the methodical attention of a woman calculating exactly how far things could be stretched. Ethan stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the fire, and something crossed his face quickly. Something he did not let stay. "You don't have to—" "You said meals were included," Clara said. "I need to know what there is to cook." He came in and leaned against the counter and watched her work. There was something about the way he occupied space. Not exactly still, but not restless either. Like a man who had used up his restlessness over 2 very long years, and had come out the other side of it into something that was not exactly peace, but functioned like it. "There's cornmeal," he said. "Salt pork in the smokehouse, not much. I was planning to go to the store day after tomorrow." "I can make something tonight," Clara said. "Tomorrow, I'll make a proper list." "All right." She made Johnny cakes and fried what salt pork there was with onions she found half forgotten in a burlap bag under the counter, and it was not an impressive supper, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. They ate at the kitchen table, Ethan, Rose, Lucy, and Clara, with the lamp throwing yellow light into the corners of the room and the wind picking up outside the patched window. Lucy ate 3 Johnny cakes and talked without stopping about a plan she was developing involving the barn cats and an empty crate, the details of which suggested considerable ambition and equally considerable impracticality. Ethan listened and occasionally said things like, "We'll see about that," in the tone of a man who knows he will, in fact, be seen about that, whether he wants to or not. Rose ate in silence. She ate carefully, cutting things into smaller pieces than necessary, the way people do when they're using a task to avoid looking at something they don't want to look at. Clara ate and said nothing and watched all 3 of them and catalogued what she saw. Lucy was loved absolutely and securely, and knew it. Ethan was grieving in the particular sustained way of people who have been grieving for long enough that they no longer notice they're doing it. Rose was frightened, not of Clara specifically, but of change, which for a 13-year-old girl who had already lost her mother was a reasonable thing to be frightened of. After supper, Rose washed up without being asked and put Lucy to bed without being asked, and Ethan sat at the table with a cup of coffee he had poured but was not drinking and stared at nothing in particular. Clara finished washing the pan and said, without turning around, "The window over the sink. I can fix the glass if you have a spare pane in the barn." "There might be something out there," Ethan said. "I haven't looked." "I'll look tomorrow." She dried her hands. "What else needs doing that isn't getting done?" He looked at her. "You've been here 3 hours." "I can see the list getting longer the more I look around," she said. "I'd rather know what's on it." A long pause. Outside, the wind pushed at the oilcloth patch. "The fence on the north pasture is down in 2 places," he said. "I've got cattle drifting because of it. The root cellar door is off its hinges, the barn roof has been leaking, and I've been meaning to tar it before the rains come, but—" He stopped. "There are other things." "I'll make a list," Clara said. "You keep saying that." "Because lists help." He almost smiled. Not quite. "Rose is going to be difficult," he said, with the particular resignation of a man making an honest report. "I know." "She's not bad," he said. She's protecting what she has left," Clara said. "That's not difficult. That's sensible." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you so sure of all this?" Clara looked at him. "Because I was a child once who needed to protect what she had left," she said, "and I did it by making everyone who got close enough to matter go away before they could leave on their own." It was more than she had meant to say. She could feel that the instant she said it, the slight miscalculation, the sentence that had come out further than intended. She picked up her canvas bag from the floor. "I'll take whatever room is available," she said. He told her the small room off the back of the house, used for storage now. There was a cot under a canvas tarp, and she pulled it out and dusted it off and lay down on it in the dark with her canvas bag beside her and the sound of the wind in the oak tree outside the single small window. The ranch creaked around her, the familiar sounds of wood settling, animals in the barn, the distant punctuation of a coyote somewhere north of the creek. She did not let herself think about how long this would last. She lay in the dark and thought instead about the window and the fence and the root cellar door and the state of the pantry shelves and the list of what needed doing, because the list was real, and real was something she could work with. She was asleep before the lamp in the kitchen went out. She fixed the window first. There was a spare pane of glass in the barn, exactly as she had suspected, leaning against the back wall behind a broken harrow, dusty but uncracked, the right size if she trimmed the frame slightly. She found a putty knife, a block of wood, and a small amount of glazing compound in a tin that was drying out, but still workable if she mixed a little linseed oil into it. It took her most of the morning, and she cut her thumb on the glass, removing the oilcloth patch, and the glazing bead was not as even as she would have liked. But when she was done, the wind no longer came through the kitchen sink window. and that was the point. She was cleaning up the tools when Rose appeared in the kitchen doorway. The girl looked at the window, looked at Clara, looked back at the window. "Papa was going to fix that," she said. "He's got the north fence to deal with," Clara said, "and the barn roof. He was going to fix it. Now he doesn't have to." Clara rinsed her hands in the basin. "Is there anything in this kitchen you know how to cook?" A pause. Rose came in a step, suspicious of the question. "Some things." "What things?" "Cornbread, beans. I can fry eggs." "All right," Clara said, "tonight you cook. I'll watch and learn your way of doing it, so I'm not making things different from what your family's used to." Rose stood there looking for the trap in this and not quite finding it. "Why would you do it my way?" "Because you've been feeding this family," Clara said. "You know what they like, I don't." It was true, and it was also strategic, and Clara knew both of those things simultaneously and felt no particular conflict about it. The girl needed to feel that her ground was not being taken from her. That was simple enough to understand. Rose made cornbread and beans that evening. They were good, seasoned well, the cornbread browned properly on the bottom, the beans with a piece of fat back that had been simmering since midday. Clara ate them and said so plainly, without excess. And Ethan ate 2 portions and told Rose the same, and Lucy said she liked Clara's Johnny cakes better, which caused a brief and predictable diplomatic incident that Ethan handled with the weary competence of a man who has been navigating small crises between daughters for 13 years. That night, doing the washing up, Clara stood beside Rose at the dry sink, and they worked without speaking for several minutes. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the particular silence of 2 people deciding what they were to each other. "How long are you staying?" Rose asked. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "My father paid your debt." "Yes." "So you're working it off?" "That's the arrangement." Rose handed her a pan to dry. "And then?" Clara dried the pan and set it on the shelf and thought about the honest answer. "I don't plan further ahead than the work that needs doing," she said. "Right now there's a lot of work that needs doing." Rose looked at her sideways. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." The girl seemed to turn this over. Then she handed Clara another pan and said nothing more about it, which Clara took as a provisional acceptance of terms. The days that followed were not easy, and they were not graceful, and they did not proceed in a straight line. That was the truth of it. The root cellar door had to be rehung, which required Ethan's strength and Clara's persistence about the angle of the hinges, and they got into a brief and practical argument about it that ended with the door working correctly, and neither of them entirely willing to admit the other had been right about part of it. The north fence took 3 days, Ethan riding out at dawn, Clara following with a wagon of posts and wire, and the 2 of them working in the kind of companionable near silence that develops between people who are both competent at physical work and have learned not to waste breath on talk while their hands are occupied. She was not strong in the way that ranch work usually required. She knew that. She was thin and not particularly muscled, and there were things she simply could not do without help. Driving fence posts, lifting heavy feed bags, managing the water trough when it needed cleaning. But she was methodical, and she did not stop when something resisted her, and she had a particular quality that Ethan noticed without naming for several days, which was that she never started a task she wasn't sure she could finish. On the 4th day, she rode into Black Ridge alone. She had $3.20 exactly. Or rather, she had spent the previous 3 evenings mending, working through the contents of a sewing basket she had found under the bed in her room. Shirts with missing buttons, a split seam on a pair of Rose's school trousers, 2 of Ethan's work shirts with collars worn through that she carefully turned so the good fabric faced out. She estimated the value of the work in her head, told Ethan at breakfast, and he looked at her for a moment and then took coins from the tin above the fireplace without comment. She went to Grady's meal house first and asked for work. Grady was a small man with a large mustache who had the specific quality of a person who regrets most decisions after making them. He looked at Clara across his counter and said he'd heard she was out at the Calloway place now. "I am," Clara said, "but I'd like to take in mending from your customers. If you let me put a card on your counter, I'll give you 10% of whatever work comes in." Grady considered this. "Martha Pierce comes in here," he said, by way of warning. "I know. She's already been talking." "I imagine so," Clara said. Grady looked at her a moment longer, then said, "Fine, but if she gives me grief about it, the card comes down." "Fair enough." She put a small card on Grady's counter, written in her clear, even hand. Mending and alterations. Reasonable rates. Inquire at the Callaway Ranch, Pinto Creek Road. Then she went to the dry goods store, not Oates's, the other one, run by a woman named Ida Marsh, who sold fabric and thread and patterns, and who looked at Clara over her spectacles with the curious, non-judgmental attention of someone who has seen a great many people pass through and made a point of not forming opinions before they were warranted. "I heard you pulled that Callaway girl off the roan mare last week," Ida said. "The horse did most of it," Clara said. "That's not what people are saying." "What are people saying?" Ida smiled slightly. "Depends who you ask." She set a bolt of muslin on the counter. "You sewing for the Callaway girls?" "Yes, ma'am. Rose has a dress that's been let out as far as it'll go, and Lucy needs winter things." "I'll give you a fair price, and you can pay when the work comes in," Ida said. "You've got an honest face." Clara paid in cash. She insisted on it, because credit had already been the source of one public disaster this month, and she had no interest in repeating the experience, and rode back to the ranch with fabric and thread and a paper of pins and the particular quiet satisfaction of a plan that was, so far, working. The mending work came in faster than she had expected. A ranch wife came out from town the following week with a coat that needed its lining replaced. Then the school teacher, a mild man named Garrett, sent word through Ida that he had several items needing attention. Clara worked in the evenings after supper, at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, her fingers moving steadily through the familiar motions. It was not exciting work. It was exactly the kind of work that kept her hands busy and her mind ordered, which was what she needed. It was during one of these evenings that Rose came and sat down across from her at the table. She had her school books with her, which she set down without opening them. She watched Clara work for a minute. "You went to school?" she asked. "Some," Clara said. "Not consistently." "Why not?" Clara threaded a new needle. "I moved around a lot when I was young. Schools change when you change towns." Rose was quiet for a moment. "I haven't been going," she said. "To school. Not since Mama—" She stopped. "Papa doesn't know. I mean, he knows I'm not going, but he doesn't know it's been since February." Clara kept her eyes on her work. "That's a long time." "I didn't see the point." "What changed?" Rose looked at her hands on the table. "I don't know that anything has," she said. Garrett sent a note. He said I'm behind, but not too far behind to catch up if I start back before winter term." "Do you want to go back?" "I don't know." "That's different from no," Clara said. A pause. "Mama wanted me to finish school," Rose said. It came out flat, like a fact being reported rather than a feeling, which Clara recognized as the tone of someone who has cried about something so many times that it no longer sounds like crying. "Then I expect she still does," Clara said, and then caught herself, because that was the kind of thing that invited a particular conversation she was not equipped to have at a kitchen table over a coat lining. She set her sewing down. "I'll walk you in on Monday if you want, or ride you in on the wagon, whichever." Rose looked up. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." "It'll be—" Rose stopped again. "People will say things." "About you?" "About you. About you coming out here. About what you are to Papa." She said the last part with the slightly strangled quality of a 13-year-old who does not know quite how to frame a question she's been carrying for 10 days. Clara looked at her directly. "I work for your father," she said. "That's all. And if people want to say more than that, they'll say it whether you go to school on Monday or not, so you might as well go." Rose looked at her for a long moment, the searching look of a young person trying to determine whether an adult is telling them the truth or the version of the truth that makes them cooperative. Then she opened her schoolbook and started reading, and Clara picked her sewing back up, and the lamp burned between them. Monday morning, Rose was ready before the wagon was hitched. Ethan came out of the barn to find Clara already in the seat and Rose on the bench beside her, schoolbooks in her lap, hair braided in a way that suggested Clara's hands had been involved. He stood in the yard for a moment looking at this, and then he looked at Clara, and she looked back at him steadily, and he said nothing. He went back inside and came out with his hat and climbed up on the other side of Rose, and they drove into town in the clear autumn morning, and Clara thought that Ethan Calloway was either a very private man or a very careful one, and possibly both. Because the thing she could see in his face, the thing that was moving through him as he drove, he put away quickly and efficiently, and she respected that because she understood it. She dropped them at the schoolhouse and drove to Ida's for thread, and then to Grady's to check on the card. 2 more inquiries. Good. Martha Pierce was leaving the meal house just as Clara arrived. The 2 women stood on the boardwalk outside Grady's door, and there was a moment, very brief, very deliberate on Martha's part, in which Martha did not step aside so that Clara had to, and Clara did it without comment because a boardwalk was not a battlefield she had any interest in choosing. "Miss Bennet," Martha said. "Mrs. Pierce." "I heard Rose Calloway was in school this morning." Martha said it as though it were mildly surprising, which Clara suspected it was not. "She was," Clara said. "And I heard you've been taking in mending from half the county." Martha's tone did not change. It remained pleasant, conversational, and precisely calibrated to convey something underneath that was neither. "You've made yourself quite comfortable out there." "I'm doing the work I was taken on to do," Clara said. Martha looked at her with the small-eyed directness of a woman who has been a force in this town for 30 years and considers herself entitled to it. "You know, I'm sure Ethan means well. He's a decent man who's been stretched very thin. But I've been wondering about you, Miss Bennet. No family, no settled place. You've come from where exactly?" "Quite a few places," Clara said. "And before Black Ridge, Millvale, and before that Crater Bluff." "And you left those places because the work ran out," Clara said. "Mrs. Pierce, I have thread to pick up and a list to get through." Martha smiled. It was a genuine smile, which was somehow worse than a false one. "Of course, I just want what's best for those girls. Everyone in this town does. Ethan's been through enough without—" She paused, selecting her word with care. "Complications." "Then I suppose it's good," Clara said, "that I'm not one." She went into Ida's and let the door close behind her and stood for a moment among the bolts of fabric with her heart beating at a slightly elevated rate and her face arranged in its usual composed expression. Ida looked up from behind the counter. "Martha," she said. Not a question. "How do you know?" "That face you're wearing," Ida said. "That's the Martha Pierce face. Half the women in this county have one." And she set down her scissors. "She came in here last week asking questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "Your history, where you'd come from, whether you had family anywhere." Ida's voice was matter-of-fact. "I told her I didn't know much, and what I did know wasn't my business to share." "Thank you," Clara said. "She'll find things out anyway," Ida said. "She always does. Martha's not a bad woman, you understand. She's a woman who's afraid of disorder, and young women with no connections showing up in frontier towns strike her as inherently disorderly." She handed Clara her thread. "You might want to be careful." Clara nodded. She paid for the thread and went back out onto the street and collected her wagon and drove back toward the Pinto Creek Road. And she thought about the word careful and what it meant in practical terms. And she concluded that what it meant was keep working, keep her head down, and give Martha Pierce nothing that could be used. The pantry was the next thing. It took 3 weeks of accumulated wages and careful management, but by the second week of October, the Calloway pantry had flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, dried beans, lard, a cured ham, jars of put-up tomatoes that Ida had sold her from a neighbor's surplus, and enough coal laid in for the stove to run through December without worry. Clara kept a small ledger in her room. Money in, money out. What the mending work brought. What she spent. Because a ledger was something real you could look at when everything else felt uncertain. Ethan saw the ledger once. He had come to her room to tell her that a mare was foaling and he might need help, and the door was open and the ledger was on the small table she used as a desk, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at it. "You keep accounts," he said. "Habit," she said. He came in far enough to look at the columns. His expression moved through several things quickly. "You've been putting your wages back into the household." "Some of them." "Clara, I eat here," she said. "I use the lamp oil. It makes more sense to manage the household properly than to take money out on one side and put it back in on the other." "That's not what I hired you to do." "It's what needs doing," She closed the ledger. The mare's foaling. He stood there a moment longer, and she could see him working through something, deciding whether to press the point or let it go. He let it go. "Come on," he said, and she followed him to the barn. The foal came at midnight, a gray colt, smaller than hoped but healthy, getting to his feet in that uncoordinated, determined way that newborn things have, all legs and intention. Lucy had woken up and come down in her nightgown and was now watching from the barn door with wide eyes, and Ethan was kneeling in the straw, and Clara was there with clean rags and a steady hand, and the colt stood up and wobbled and found his feet and stood there in the lamplight of the barn, and for a moment the four of them, man, two girls, and one young woman who was not sure what she was to any of them, watched the new animal learn what it was to be alive in the world. "Can I name him?" Lucy asked. "He's not ours," Ethan said. "He belongs to the Hendersons. He was just foaling here." "Can I name him anyway?" "You can name him until they come to get him," Ethan said. "Button," Lucy announced, "because his spots look like buttons." The colt had no spots whatsoever. Ethan looked at Clara over Lucy's head. Clara looked back. "Button it is," Ethan said. She did not realize until she was walking back to the house in the cold dark, Lucy's hand in hers, and Rose a step behind, that she had not thought once in the last 2 hours about her ledger, or the thread she needed to pick up, or Martha Pierce, or any of the other things that constituted the running machinery of her days. She had just been there, in the barn, in the moment, with these 3 people and a gray colt named Button. She noticed it. She filed it away carefully, the way you file away things that could cost you something if you're not careful about them. The trouble with Martha Pierce was not that the woman said false things. That was what Clara had not anticipated, the part that made it harder than expected to counter. Martha said true things, incomplete things, things stripped of context, but factually accurate things. And she said them to exactly the right people, to the members of the county social committee, of which she was the longtime chairwoman, to the wives of the 3 largest landowners in the area, with whom she had Sunday dinners. Too, Clara learned from Ida, at least 2 members of the committee that handled Ethan's custody case. The case that had been grinding through the county system for nearly a year now, since the girl's maternal grandmother in Garnet had filed claiming that Ethan was not providing adequate care or a stable home environment. The committee had a new session scheduled. Clara had known this in a general way since arriving. Ethan had mentioned it once, briefly, in the tone of a man reporting something he has accepted, but she had not known the specific date until one afternoon in late October, when she came back from town to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in front of him and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. "What is it?" she said. Not a question, quite. He pushed the letter across the table. She picked it up and read it. County Inspector's Office. A formal review of the Calloway household. Date, the 17th of November. A representative of the court would conduct a home visit and interview the children, following which a full hearing would be held in the county seat. She set it down. "All right," she said. "The grandmother's been pushing for this for months," Ethan said. "She has a lawyer. I don't." He said it the way people say things they have spent considerable time accepting. "Is there anything in the house that isn't in order?" He looked at her. 3 months ago? Everything." He paused. "Now? No. The place looks better than it has in 2 years." "Then we show them a house that's in order," Clara said, "and children who are well." "It's not just the house," he said. Martha's been talking to the committee. "They're going to hear about you." "I know. They'll ask about you, who you are, where you came from, why you're here." "Then I'll answer," she said. Ethan looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub oak, and Lucy's voice came faintly from upstairs where she was playing some game that involved several things falling over in sequence. "I need you to understand," he said finally, "that if this goes wrong, if they decide the house isn't stable, that I can't lose those girls, Clara." She looked at him. In the weeks since she had come to Calloway Ranch, she had learned his face the way you learn any territory you live in. Not studying it exactly, just absorbing it through daily proximity. She knew the line between his brows that appeared when he was worried about the cattle. She knew the particular set of his shoulders when he was exhausted. She had not seen this before. This stripped down, unguarded fear. It was the same thing she had seen in Rose's face the first evening, and in Lucy's when the horse had panicked. It was the Calloway family's essential vulnerability, the thing they all shared, worn differently by each of them. "You're not going to lose them," she said. "You can't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I can help make it less likely." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "You could leave. This isn't your problem." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the barn at midnight and the gray colt and Lucy's hand in hers walking back through the cold. She thought about Rose at the kitchen table with her school books open, catching up on 7 months of work she'd let slide because the world had seemed too much to be worth the effort. She thought about the pantry with its rows of jars, and the window that no longer let in the wind, and the ledger with its careful columns. "I know what it costs to not belong anywhere," she said. "I've been paying it for a long time." She picked up the letter and set it in the middle of the table. "Let's figure out what they're going to ask and make sure we're ready." It was not a declaration. It was not a confession. It was just the truth, said plainly, in the kitchen of a ranch house on a creek in the middle of the frontier, on a cold autumn evening, with the wind in the oaks and a child playing upstairs. Ethan Calloway looked at the letter, and then at Clara Bennett, and then he nodded. And they got to work. The 17th of November arrived with the kind of weather that seems designed to make everything harder. Not a dramatic storm, nothing that would give you something to point at and say there, "That's the problem." Just a low gray sky pressing down on the hills, and a cold that got into the house through gaps you hadn't known existed, and a thin, persistent drizzle that turned the yard to mud and made the whole ranch look, Clara thought, like something a person might write home about if they were trying to make someone feel sorry for them. She had been up since 4. The stove was lit and the kitchen was warm, and the smell of coffee had been working its way through the house since before dawn. She had baked bread the night before, 2 loaves, because fresh bread made a kitchen smell like a home, and she was not above being strategic about it. And there was a pot of oatmeal going for the girls and a proper breakfast laid out that was neither too elaborate, which would look like performance, nor too sparse, which would look like neglect. Clara had spent considerable time thinking about this calibration and had concluded that the right amount of effort was exactly the amount that would have been there on any other morning. She heard Ethan on the stairs at 5:30. He came into the kitchen already dressed, which meant he hadn't slept much either, and he looked at the table and then at her and said, "You didn't have to do all this." "The inspector arrives at 10, she said. "Sit down and eat." He sat. He ate. He did not say much, which was normal for him in the mornings, and Clara appreciated it because she did not have much to say either, and pretending otherwise would have cost energy she was not sure she could spare. Rose came down at 6:30 with Lucy, both of them dressed. Lucy's hair braided more carefully than usual, which meant Rose had done it, which meant Rose understood the weight of the day, even though she and Clara had not discussed it directly. Clara had decided not to discuss it directly with the girls. Children performed unnaturally when they knew they were being observed for assessment, and performance was the one thing that an experienced county inspector would see through immediately. What she wanted them to be was themselves, which required them to forget, as much as possible, that this morning was different from any other. "Lucy," she said, setting oatmeal in front of the girl, "after breakfast, I need you to bring Button's blanket in from the porch and fold it properly." "Button went home last week," Lucy said. "I know. The blanket's still on the porch. It needs folding." "That's a small job." "Small jobs still need doing." Lucy considered this. "Can I name the blanket something?" "No," said Ethan and Rose simultaneously. Ordinary morning. That was what Clara was manufacturing. It was not dishonest. It was just the deliberate creation of conditions in which the people she cared about could function without falling apart. The word "cared about" moved through her brain and kept going. She didn't examine it. Inspector Harold Gaines arrived at 10 minutes past 10, which Clara had already accounted for in her mental schedule. He was a man of perhaps 55, gray-haired, with the measured, unhurried quality of someone who has done this job long enough to know that rushing always produces less information than patience. He came in a county buggy, driven by a young clerk who waited outside, and he carried a leather satchel and wore good boots, and looked at the ranch house with the professional assessment of a man who has seen many ranch houses under many circumstances. Ethan met him at the door. "Mr. Calloway," Gaines said, extending his hand. "Harold Gaines, County Inspector's Office. Thank you for having me." "Come in," Ethan said. Clara had positioned herself in the kitchen, not hiding, visible through the doorway, doing something practical, which at this moment was mending a tear in one of Ethan's work shirts. She looked up when Gaines came through the main room, and she nodded, and he nodded back, and that was the introduction for now. He walked through the house first. That was his process. Clara could see it, the systematic way his eyes moved over rooms, registering without reacting. The main room, clean, fire burning, a rag rug on the floor that Clara had repaired 2 weeks ago where the edge had been unraveling. The girls' room, beds made, Rose's school books stacked on the small desk Clara had found in the barn and cleaned up and installed for exactly this purpose. The kitchen, organized, pantry full, the window over the sink solid in its repaired frame. He came back to the main room and sat down in the chair that Ethan indicated and put his satchel on his knee and opened it. "I'll need to speak with the children separately," he said. "Standard process." "Of course," Ethan said. "And with you, and with—" He looked toward the kitchen doorway. "I believe you have a household employee?" "Clara Bennett," Ethan said. "Yes. I'll want to speak with her as well." He spoke with Lucy first, which Clara suspected was deliberate. Get the youngest one done early, before nerves could transmit themselves down the household chain. Lucy sat across from him in the main room while Ethan waited in the kitchen, and Clara found tasks to do in the back of the house that kept her within earshot without being in the room. She could hear Lucy's voice, clear and unhesitating, the voice of a child who had not yet learned to be guarded. She heard the inspector ask about school, about meals, about whether she was warm enough at night, about her sister, about her father. Lucy answered all of it with the particular stream of consciousness honesty of a 5-year-old, which meant she also provided extensive information about Button the colt and his blanket, and the fact that Clara made better Johnny cakes than Rose, but Rose's cornbread was better and Papa burned eggs, but only a little bit, and Clara fixed the window, and now the kitchen wasn't cold anymore. Clara stood in the hallway and felt something move in her chest and put it away. Rose's interview was longer. Clara could hear the lower register of it, Rose's voice. More careful than Lucy's, more considered, but not the content. When it was over, Rose came out and found Clara in the back room and said quietly, "He asked if I felt safe." "What did you say?" Clara asked. "I said yes." Rose paused. "He asked if you made me feel safe." Clara looked at her. "What did you say?" Rose looked back, and for a moment she was not a guarded 13-year-old performing suspicion as a personality. She was just a girl who had been carrying too much for too long. "I said you were the first person in a year who made things feel like they might work out," she said. Then she went upstairs before Clara could respond to that, which was probably sensible of both of them. Ethan's interview took half an hour. Clara sat in the kitchen and heard nothing of it and worked through 2 shirts and the hem of Lucy's winter dress, and did not let herself speculate. Then Gaines appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Miss Bennett," he said, "would you have a few minutes?" "Yes," she said. She set the sewing down and folded her hands on the table. He came in and sat across from her, same way he had sat across from the others, satchel open, a small notebook in his hand. "How long have you been employed at the Callaway Ranch?" he began. "About 6 weeks," she said. "And your arrangement with Mr. Callaway, can you describe it?" "I do household work, cooking, mending, repairs where I can manage them. He provides room and board and a small wage." "And before coming here?" "I was in Black Ridge briefly. Before that, Millvale, and Crater Bluff before that." He wrote something. "Any family in the area?" "No family anywhere," she said. He looked up from the notebook, not unkindly. "No family at all?" "No," she said. "I grew up in foster households. Several of them." He held her gaze for a moment. "I see." He wrote something else. "And your relationship with the children, can you describe it?" "I cook for them. I help Lucy with her hair when Rose isn't available. I walked Rose back to school when she'd been absent for a long while." Clara paused. "I try not to get in the way of what her father does. He's a good father. He's been managing a lot." "In your assessment," Gaines said, "would you say this is a stable home environment?" "In my assessment," Clara said, "it's more stable than most homes I've lived in, and I've lived in quite a few." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but registering. "One more question," he said, "off the record, if you're willing." "All right." "Why are you here?" You have no family, no land, no particular tie to this county. You could be anywhere. Clara thought about the honest answer. She had been thinking about it since the morning of the 17th when she woke at 4 and lay in the dark of her small room, listening to the ranch sleep around her. I was that child once, she said, the one whose future gets decided by people in a room who've never met her. Foster households, county committees, inspectors with notebooks. She kept her voice level. I know what it is to have someone else's decision determine whether you get to stay somewhere or get put back out. She looked at him steadily. These girls already lost their mother. I'm not going to let anything else be taken from them that doesn't have to be. Gaines looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook. Thank you, Miss Bennett, he said. He left shortly after. The clerk brought the buggy around and Gaines climbed in, and they went back down the Pinto Creek Road toward town, and the gray sky kept doing what it had been doing all day, and Ethan stood on the porch watching the buggy go, and Clara stood beside him, and neither of them said anything. How do you think it went? He said finally. I think it went as well as we could make it go, she said. He was quiet. The hearing's in 3 weeks. I know. He turned and went inside, and Clara stood on the porch a moment longer in the cold drizzle and looked at the yard. The repaired fence post at the gate, the kitchen garden that was done for the season but was laid out now for spring planting, the barn with its tarred roof, the whole working machinery of the place. And she thought, it has to be enough. It had to be, because she had nothing else to offer. What she did not know, standing on that porch, was what had been set in motion in town while she and Ethan had been preparing for Harold Gaines. She found out 4 days later. Ida Marsh told her. Clara had come in for thread, and Ida had come around from behind the counter and said, in the particular tone she used when delivering news she did not enjoy delivering, Martha Pierce had a meeting. What kind of meeting? Clara asked. With Evelyn Morse, Ida said. That's the grandmother's lawyer's associate, the one handling the custody case from the Garnett side. She paused. Martha brought documentation. What documentation? County records from Millvale, Ida said. And from Crater Bluff. She looked at Clara steadily. She wrote to both counties, Clara. 2 weeks ago. She's been collecting. Clara stood very still in the middle of the fabric store. What did the records show? Millvale. You left without notice after 3 months. There's a note from the boarding house that you had difficulty meeting rent. Ida's voice was careful and kind, in the way of someone reading a sentence they wished they didn't have to read. Crater Bluff. There was some dispute with an employer over wages. The employer shorted me 2 weeks, Clara said. I took the matter to the county clerk. The clerk sided with the employer because the employer was the clerk's brother-in-law. I believe you, Ida said, but on paper it says there was a dispute. She paused. Martha is also citing your time in the foster system. She's arguing that a young woman with no stable family history, no permanent address, and a pattern of, her words, transient employment should not be considered a suitable companion for children in a contested custody situation. Clara said nothing. She's presenting it at the hearing, Ida said. She's been asked to provide a character statement as a community member. The hearing was in Black Ridge's county courtroom, which was attached to the back of the sheriff's office and held perhaps 40 people if they were willing to stand. On the morning of the 8th of December, it held 53, because word had gotten around, and because in a frontier town on a cold December morning, a custody hearing with multiple interesting parties was the closest thing to theater that a Tuesday provided. Clara had not expected the room to be full. She stood at the back with her coat on while Ethan took his place at the front with his legal representative. A man named Fowler, who was not exactly a lawyer but had passed the territorial bar examination twice and was the best Ethan could afford. And she looked at the room and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that this had become something larger than a home visit. The Garnett side had their lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Albright, who had the aggressive confidence of someone who is being paid well enough to be certain. The grandmother, Mildred Voss, sat beside him, a severe woman in her 60s who had lost her daughter to fever and had apparently decided that the correct response was to reclaim everything her daughter had left behind, including her grandchildren. Judge Warren Caldwell presided. He was a man Clara had not encountered before, heavy-set, in his 60s, with a gray beard and eyes that moved through a room slowly and missed nothing. The proceedings began formally enough. Albright presented the grandmother's case, Ethan's financial difficulties, the documented household instability of the previous year, Rose's extended absence from school, Sham. He was measured about it, which made it worse than if he had been melodramatic. Measured meant the facts stood without needing embellishment. Fowler responded with the inspection report from Harold Gaines, which noted a clean and organized household, well-fed children, and evidence of recent substantial improvements to the home. He noted Rose's return to school. He noted the full pantry and the repaired structures. Then Albright called Martha Pierce. Martha came to the front of the room with the manner of a woman who is doing an unpleasant duty and wants everyone to know that she considers it a duty and not a pleasure, which Clara suspected was not entirely true. She sat in the chair that served as a witness stand and answered Albright's questions in a clear, steady voice. She covered Clara's history methodically. The brevity of her time in each town, the lack of family, the employment record in Millvale and Crater Bluff. She did not embellish. She didn't need to. Each fact, presented cleanly and without apparent malice, was simply a brick in a wall. And the wall was building said, "This is not a stable person, and stability is what these children need." In your view as a community member, Albright said, does the presence of Miss Bennett at the Calloway household represent a concern for the welfare of these children? In my view, Martha said carefully, a young woman with no settled history, no family connections, and a pattern of short-term employment in multiple counties is not someone we can easily assess. And when the welfare of children is at stake, I believe the community has an obligation to ask questions that may be uncomfortable. She was not wrong, Clara thought. That was the hardest part. She was not wrong. Judge Caldwell looked up from his notes. Is Miss Bennett present? A beat of silence. Then Clara said from the back of the room, Yes, sir. Every head in the room turned. Caldwell looked at her. Would you come forward, please? She walked to the front of the room through 53 people who were watching her with the full spectrum of frontier town attention. Some hostile, some curious, some simply waiting to see what happened next. She sat in the chair Martha had vacated and put her hands in her lap and looked at the judge. Albright rose. Miss Bennett, is it true that you have lived in more than 6 different towns in the past 4 years? Yes, she said. Is it true that you have no family? Yes. Is it true that you were raised in foster households following the death of your parents? Clara paused one beat. My mother died when I was 4. My father left before that. I was in foster care from the age of 4 until I was 16. And in that time, Clara said, not loudly, but with the particular quality of a voice that is not going to be talked over, I lived in 7 different households. Not one of them was my choice. Not one of them asked me what I wanted or where I wanted to go. She looked at Albright, then at Judge Caldwell, then, briefly, at Martha Pierce. Every one of those decisions about where I would live and who would care for me was made by adults in rooms who had never met me. And I know what it felt like to be the child sitting outside that room waiting to find out what my life was going to be. The room was quiet. Mrs. Pierce is right that I have no settled history, Clara said. She's right that I move frequently, and that my employment record is not what a person with a fixed home and a family would have. What she cannot tell you, because she doesn't know and didn't ask, is why. She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed none of this. She had, in fact, spent the last 3 weeks actively not thinking about what she would say if it came to this, because thinking about it had felt like something she was not ready to do. I moved because I was never anywhere that asked me to stay. I worked short-term because short-term was what I was offered. I have no family because families are not issued to children who grow up the way I did. You find them, or you build them, or you go without. She paused. What I know how to do is make a home function. I know how to look at a broken household and see what it needs. I know how to work alongside people who are grieving without making their grief worse. And I know... Her voice shifted slightly, something she had not intended. I know exactly what it costs a child to be uprooted from a place where she has finally started to feel safe. She stopped. The room stayed quiet. Then Rose Calloway stood up. She was in the 3rd row beside Lucy, and she stood up the way young people stand up when they've decided to do something before they can talk themselves out of it, all at once, with the kind of committed physical act that makes retreat impossible. Can I say something? She said. Judge Caldwell looked at her over his spectacles. "Young lady, this is a formal proceeding." "I know," Rose said, "but she's talking about my home, and I think I should get to say something about my own home." A pause. Caldwell looked at Fowler, who gave a small nod. Caldwell looked back at Rose. "Briefly," he said. Rose put her hands at her sides, the way Clara had seen her do when she was steadying herself for something she found difficult. "Before Clara came," she said, "I hadn't been to school in 7 months. The pantry had maybe 3 days of food in it most of the time. The window in the kitchen was broken and the cold came through it every night." She spoke to the judge, but her voice carried to the whole room. "My father is a good father. He's always been a good father, but he was drowning, and he didn't want us to see it, so he was drowning quietly." She paused. Clara saw it, and she just started fixing things. Not because anyone asked her to, not because she had to, because that's who she is. Rose's voice cracked slightly, and she held it together by sheer will. "Lucy and I haven't been taken care of like this since our mama was alive. And I think if you take this apart, if you take our family apart, because of where Clara came from and what her paperwork looks like, then you're doing exactly what she just said. You're making a decision about children without asking them what they need." She sat down. Lucy immediately grabbed her hand. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Martha Pierce, in her seat near the front, was looking at the floor. Judge Caldwell took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at Clara, who was still sitting in the witness chair with her hands in her lap, and her face composed and something behind her eyes that she was working to keep there. "Miss Bennett," he said, "how long have you been at the Callaway Ranch?" 6 weeks, Your Honor. And in that 6 weeks, I repaired the kitchen window, rehung the root cellar door, helped repair the north fence, organized the pantry and brought it to a reasonable level for winter, took in mending work to supplement the household income, and got Rose back to school." A pause. "You did all of that in 6 weeks. There was a lot to do," Clara said. Something moved in Caldwell's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. He put his spectacles back on and looked down at his papers. Albright made his closing argument, thorough, professional, citing the documented instability and the grandmother's genuine affection for her grandchildren. Fowler made his, citing the inspection report, the clear improvement in household conditions, the testimony of the children themselves. Clara sat back down in the gallery, and Ethan did not look at her, but his hand on the bench between them was very slightly closer to her hand than it needed to be, and she was aware of it. The judge did not rule immediately. He said he would consider the matter and issue his ruling within the week. The room began to move and talk, and people filed out into the cold December air, and Clara sat for a moment without moving. Martha Pierce passed her on the way to the door. She stopped. Clara looked up at her. Martha's expression was not triumphant. It was not apologetic either. It was the expression of a woman who genuinely believed she had done what the situation required and was not yet sure whether she had been right. "I did not say anything untrue," Martha said quietly. "No," Clara said. "You didn't." Martha looked at her for a moment longer, then she put on her coat and went out. Ethan was waiting at the door with the girls. Lucy was tired and leaning against his side. Rose looked at Clara as she approached with the specific look of someone who has just done something they can't take back and is in the process of deciding whether they're glad about it. "What you said in there," Clara said to her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Rose said. "It was brave." Rose looked at her steadily. "Well," she said, "I learned it from someone." They went out together into the cold, and the wagon was waiting, and the hills along Pinto Creek were gray-brown under the gray sky, and Clara climbed up onto the bench, and Ethan handed Lucy up to her, and she held the sleeping child against her side and felt the warmth of the small body and the cold of the air and the uncertain weight of a week of waiting pressing down on all of them at once. The horse started moving. The wheels found the road. The town fell behind. She did not know what the judge would decide. She did not know what the week would bring. But she had said the true thing. In front of all those people, in the room where decisions were made, and it was the only true thing she had, and she had given it without holding back, and whatever happened now, she had done that. It would have to be enough. She held Lucy close against the cold and watched the road unwind ahead of them toward home. The week of waiting was the worst kind of week. The kind where ordinary life keeps demanding your attention, regardless of the fact that something large and unresolved is sitting in the middle of everything. The cattle still needed feeding. The stove still needed coal. Lucy still needed her hair braided in the mornings and her socks found, which was an ongoing domestic challenge because Lucy treated socks as optional accessories and could not be persuaded otherwise. The mending work still came in: 3 shirts and a coat from a ranch wife up the road, and 2 pairs of trousers from the school teacher Garrett, who had apparently decided that Clara's work was good enough to become a regular arrangement. Life at the Callaway Ranch continued in all its practical, unglamorous detail, because life did not pause for courthouse deliberations. But underneath all of it, steady as a low hum you can't quite locate, was the waiting. Ethan managed it by working. Clara had learned this about him in the weeks she'd been at the ranch, that physical labor was how he processed the things he couldn't control. He was up before 5 every morning that week, out in the barn or at the fence line, or doing something with the equipment in the shed that probably didn't need doing yet but benefited from the attention. He came in for meals and sat with the girls and was present for them in the focused, deliberate way of a man reminding himself what he was fighting for. He didn't talk much about the hearing. Clara managed it by not managing it, by which she meant she caught herself several times across that week, standing in the kitchen or the back room with her hand stopped in the middle of some task, staring at nothing, her mind gone somewhere it had no productive business going. She would register this and redirect herself and go back to whatever she'd been doing. It was not graceful. It was the only thing available. Rose managed it by studying. She came home from school every afternoon that week and sat at her desk and worked with the particular driven focus of someone who has decided that if she cannot control outcomes, she can at least control her own preparation. On Thursday evening, Clara brought her a cup of tea and Rose looked up from her arithmetic with eyes that were tired in a way that had nothing to do with arithmetic. And they looked at each other for a moment. "It's going to be all right," Clara said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out anyway. "You don't know that," Rose said. "No," Clara agreed. "I said it anyway." Rose looked at her a moment longer. "Why?" "Because sometimes saying the thing out loud makes the waiting more bearable," Clara said. "It's not a guarantee, it's just noise against the quiet." Rose turned this over. "That's not very reassuring." "No," Clara said, "but it's honest." Rose almost smiled. Almost. She picked up her pencil and went back to her arithmetic, and Clara went back to the kitchen, and the ranch settled around them into the particular cold silence of a December night on the frontier. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after the hearing. Clara was in the yard when the county mail rider came down the Pinto Creek Road, and she saw him turn in at the gate and called to Ethan in the barn. And Ethan came out still holding a piece of harness he'd been mending, and the rider handed down an envelope with the county seal on it, and then turned his horse and went back the way he'd come, because mail riders on the frontier had no interest in the consequences of their deliveries. Ethan looked at the envelope. Clara stood 6 feet away and looked at him, looking at it and did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. He opened it. She watched him read it. His face did not give her much, it never did when things mattered, but she saw the line between his brows, which had been present for 8 days, shift and then slowly release. He read the letter twice, then he lowered it and looked at her. "They stay," he said. Clara breathed. It was not a dramatic breath. She didn't make a sound. She just breathed, the way you breathe when something that has been sitting on your chest for 8 days lifts itself off. "Both of them?" she said. "Both of them. Full custody confirmed. The grandmother gets supervised visits, 2 per year if the girls agree to it." He looked back at the letter. Judge Caldwell noted the condition of the household, the children's testimony, the inspection report. He stopped. "He noted yours." Clara looked at the ground for a moment, at the mud in the yard, frozen now at the edges, at her own boot toes. Then she looked up. "Good," she said. Ethan Callaway looked at her across the 6 feet of frozen yard, with the letter in one hand and the harness piece in the other, and his face did what it did when something moved through him that he had not fully planned for, went still and then complicated and then still again. "I'm going to tell the girls," he said. "Yes," she said. "Go." He went inside. Clara stood in the yard and heard a moment later Rose's voice from inside the house. Not words, just a sound, high and sudden. The particular involuntary sound a person makes when relief arrives after they've been holding themselves together for too long. Then Lucy's voice, rapid and excited, not fully understanding, but understanding enough. Then Ethan's voice, lower, steadying them. Clara went to the barn. She stood with the horses in the warm animal dark and put her hand on the neck of the bay mare and just stood there for a while. She did not cry. She wasn't sure exactly what she felt. It was too large and too mixed up to have one name for it, and she was not someone who needed to name everything in order to survive it. She just stood there and let the horses breathe around her and let the feeling, whatever it was, move through without cataloging it. After a while, she went back inside and started on supper. The celebration that evening was not elaborate. Clara made a proper roast. She'd been saving a decent cut of beef from the Hendersons, who had brought it as payment for a bit of fence work Ethan had done for them the previous month. And there were potatoes and good bread and a dried apple pie that she had been planning for the right occasion. It was the best meal the Calloway kitchen had produced since she'd arrived, and they all knew it without saying so. Lucy ate until she was visibly round with it and then pushed her plate away with great satisfaction. "I want to tell Button," she announced. "Button is in Garnet," Ethan said. "I know. I want to write him a letter." "You can't write a letter to a horse, Lucy." "You said I could name him." "I said you could name him until the Hendersons came to get him." "Well, he still has the name," Lucy said, with the air of someone who considers this a solid point. "Names don't go away when horses do." Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at her plate. "You could write to the Hendersons," Rose said to Lucy, with the patient reasoning of a sister who has navigated this kind of conversation many times, "and ask them to tell Button that you said hello." Lucy considered this. "Would they?" "Probably not," Rose said, "but you could try." "Okay." Lucy picked up her fork again, apparently satisfied. "I'll write tomorrow. Clara, how do you spell congratulations?" "Congratulations," Clara said. "That's a very long word. It's a very big thing to say." After supper, after the girls were in bed, after the kitchen was cleaned and the lamp turned down, Clara put on her coat and went out to the porch. The night was clear and bitter cold, and the stars were out in the full winter way, more stars than sky. She could hear the horses in the barn and a coyote somewhere distant and the creak of the porch boards as the cold worked at them. She heard the door behind her, and then Ethan was there, also in his coat, also looking at the stars in the way of a man who has come outside for air and possibly for company and is not going to admit to the second one. They stood for a while without talking. "I want to pay you properly," he said finally. "You've been paying me." "Ma, I've been paying you what I could manage, which isn't what the work is worth, and you know it." He was looking at the dark line of the hills, not at her. "I'm going to apply for the Eastern grazing permit in the spring. If I get it, the herd can double by fall. The income from that—" "Ethan," she said. He stopped. "I'm not leaving," she said. "You don't have to make an economic argument for me to stay." A silence. "I'm not making an economic argument," he said, in a tone that suggested he had started out making an economic argument and had arrived somewhere else partway through. Clara looked at the stars. The cold was the kind that settled into your joints if you stood still too long. "When I was 12, she said, not planning to say this, saying it anyway, "I was in a foster household in a town called Dunbar. It was the longest I'd stayed anywhere, almost 2 years. There was a woman there, Mrs. Hale, who had a kitchen garden and taught me how to put up tomatoes." She paused. "In October of my second year there, the county moved me to another placement. Better on paper, bigger house, more resources. Mrs. Hale cried when I left. I didn't, because I'd learned by then not to." She was quiet a moment. "I think about that kitchen garden more than I think about most things from my childhood. The way the tomatoes smelled on the vine. The way she showed me to test whether the jar had sealed right." She stopped. "I'm saying that I know what it is to lose a place you've started to belong to. I'm saying I don't want to know it again." Ethan turned to look at her. "I'm also saying," she continued, because she was apparently doing this now and she might as well do it completely, "that I'm not a simple person to have around. I have no family and no history that looks good on paper, And I spent 20 years learning not to need anyone, which means I'm not graceful about it when I do need someone. She looked at him. I'm not graceful about most things. I've noticed, he said. That's not reassuring. I didn't say it was a problem. She looked at him. He looked back at her in the way he had of looking at things directly and without flinching that she had noticed from the first day on the wagon bench, and for a moment neither of them said anything. I don't know what I'm asking, he said. I'm not good at this either. Eleanor, my wife, she was better at knowing what things meant. I always had to be told. He looked down at his hands. But I know that this ranch feels like a different place than it was 6 weeks ago. And I know the girls are different. And I know that I'm... He stopped. Different, he finished, which was clearly not the word he'd started toward, but was the one he'd arrived at safely. You were grieving, Clara said. You still are some. Yes, he said, but it's not the same weight it was. The coyote called again, further south now. The horses shifted in the barn. I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give, Ethan said. I want you to know that. You can stay here and work, and that's enough. That's more than enough. I'm not... He made a gesture with one hand that communicated considerable inarticulate feeling. I'm not the kind of man who would press. I know that, Clara said. That's one of approximately 4 things about you that I figured out in the first week. Only 4? I'm still working on the rest. His mouth did the thing it sometimes did, almost a smile, suppressed before it could fully arrive. She had come to wait for that, she realized. The almost smile. She had come to wait for it and note when it appeared and feel something when it did. And she recognized this now as the kind of thing that had been true for a while and that she had been carefully not examining. I want you to stay, he said. Simply. Not as an employee. I want you to be part of this, of what this is. He paused. I don't know the right way to say that. You said it fine, Clara said. Did I? Well enough. They stood on the porch in the cold for a while longer, not touching, not making any declarations larger than the ones already made, which was right. It was the right size for a porch in December on a working ranch in the frontier, and Clara had learned to mistrust feelings that seemed larger than the space they were standing in. After a while she went inside, and he came in after her, and the house was quiet and warm, and she lay in her small room in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought that this was the longest she had stayed anywhere since Mrs. Hale's kitchen garden in Dunbar, and that she was not going to ruin it by being afraid of it, and that being afraid of it and ruining it were not the same thing, and that she could be afraid and still stay. She could stay. The days that followed were ordinary and were not. The work continued, it always continued. The work was the reliable constant of frontier life, indifferent to emotional developments, but something in the texture of the days had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that a stranger would notice. But the particular quality of the silence between Clara and Ethan had changed, the way a room changes when a window is opened. Same room, different air. Rose noticed. Of course Rose noticed. She was 13 and observant and had been watching adults navigate things poorly for long enough to have developed a sharp eye for when they were navigating them less poorly than usual. She said nothing about it directly, which Clara respected. She just became, incrementally, less defended. Allowed Clara to sit beside her on the porch in the evening, stopped flinching when Clara touched her shoulder in passing, began occasionally, tentatively, asking Clara's opinion on things that were not household logistics. Do you think I could be a teacher? She asked one afternoon, while they were putting up the last of the winter stores. What kind of teacher? Clara asked. Like Garrett, school. Why do you ask? Because I like explaining things, Rose said. When Lucy doesn't understand something and I explain it, and then she understands, I like that. She paused. Is that a strange reason? It's a good reason, Clara said. Better than most. Papa thinks I should learn to run the ranch. You could do both, Clara said. Learn to run the ranch and teach school. They're not the same hours. Rose thought about this. You think so? I think you're going to figure out what you're capable of, and then you're going to do it, Clara said, regardless of what anyone tells you is possible. That's just who you are. Rose looked at her. How do you know that? Because it's what you've been doing since I got here, Clara said. You haven't stopped. You just didn't notice you were doing it. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she handed Clara a jar to shelve and said, "My mama would have liked you," in the tone of a person reporting a fact. Clara took the jar and placed it on the shelf and did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that would not be either too much or not enough. "Tell me about her," she said finally. Rose did. For the next hour, while they finished the stores and moved to the kitchen and made supper and set the table, Rose talked about her mother. Not the grief of her, not the loss, but the actual woman, Eleanor Calloway, who had been a strong-voiced, occasionally impatient person who burned most things she cooked, but made a remarkable dried apple cake and could whistle better than anyone Rose had ever heard, and had opinions about everything and shared all of them without much invitation. Rose talked and Clara listened and asked questions, and Ethan came in at the end and heard the last part of it and sat down at the table without interrupting, and Lucy came in behind him and climbed onto her chair and demanded to know why everyone was so quiet, and Rose said they were talking about Mama, and Lucy said, "Oh," and thought about it and then said, "She whistled really loud." And that made everyone at the table briefly and simultaneously sad, and also not quite sad, which was the particular complicated feeling that belonged to people who are learning to carry grief without being crushed by it. Supper that night was easy in a way that things had not been easy before. Not perfect. Lucy spilled her milk, and Rose and Ethan had a minor disagreement about whether the mayor needed the farrier before Christmas or after, and Clara burned the edge of the bread slightly, which she was annoyed about, but easy in the way of people who have decided more or less that they are in the same place together, and that this is where they are choosing to be. After supper, while Clara cleaned up, Ethan came in to get the coffee and stayed leaning against the counter, and they talked while she worked. Not about anything significant, about the Eastern grazing permit, about whether the Henderson boy who'd asked about part-time work was reliable enough to take on in the spring, about the roof on the chicken house that needed attention before the heavy snows. Practical things, frontier things. The conversation of two people who have established that they are working toward the same ends and are now in the logistics of it. At some point, Clara realized that this was the longest she had stood in a kitchen with another adult and talked without calculating whether she was saying too much or too little, or whether her continued presence was creating a debt she'd eventually be asked to repay. She had just been talking. She had just been in the room. She noticed this and let it sit, and did not make it mean more than it was, which was one evening in December in a kitchen on a ranch in the frontier, after a very hard several weeks, with a cup of coffee getting cold on the counter, and a man with honest eyes and a way of listening that did not feel like waiting for his turn. She was, she thought, not going to ruin this. On the last Saturday of December, Ethan drove into town to file the paperwork confirming the custody ruling with the county recorder. A formality, but one that needed doing. Clara stayed at the ranch with the girls, and they spent the morning in the way of people who have run out of obligatory tasks and have arrived at the less familiar territory of an unscheduled morning. Lucy drew pictures at the kitchen table. She had developed a serious drawing practice over the past several weeks, filling whatever paper was available with images of horses and houses and people of varying anatomical accuracy. Rose read. Clara mended a shirt and then put it down and sat in the morning light and did nothing for a while, which was not a thing she did naturally, but which she was attempting to learn. "Clara," Lucy said without looking up from her drawing. Are you going to stay forever?" Clara looked at the top of the girl's head, bent over her paper, crayon moving in the focused, unhurried way of a child absorbed in her work. "What are you drawing?" Clara asked. "Our house," Lucy said. "I'm putting all of us in it." "All of us." "You and me and Rose and Papa." Lucy held the paper up briefly and then went back to it. "And the gate is open." "Why is the gate open?" "Because open gates mean more people can come in," Lucy said, with the calm certainty of a 5-year-old explaining something obvious. "But nobody's leaving. I'm going to put it above the fireplace." Clara looked at the child for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to stay." Lucy nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already known, and went back to her drawing. Rose, from her chair in the corner, turned a page of her book and said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that Clara had come to recognize. The afternoon brought Ethan back from town, and he came in with the filed papers and a small paper parcel from Ida's, which turned out to be a length of blue calico that nobody had ordered, and when Clara raised an eyebrow at it, Ethan said, With the careful neutrality of a man delivering information rather than sentiment, Ida said the color was right for you. She put it on credit and said you could pay her in thread. Clara took the calico. She held it for a moment. It was good fabric. A fine, tight weave, a clear blue like October sky above the hills. "Tell her thank you," Clara said. "You can tell her yourself," Ethan said. "On Sunday, we generally go in for the market." "We?" she said. "All of us," he said. And then, because he was not a man who made large statements when small ones would carry the same weight, he went to hang his coat, and that was the end of it. Clara stood with the blue calico in her hands and looked at it and thought about the market square in Black Ridge on the day she had arrived. Oates's counter, the crowd, the stagecoach at 2:30, the whole terrible ordinary machinery of being someone with nowhere to go. She thought about the roan mare and the 5-year-old in the saddlebag, and this man crossing the square toward her with his hand extended, and the wagon bench with Lucy between them, and the Pinto Creek Road opening up ahead and the town falling away behind. 6 weeks. 6 weeks from that day to this one. She put the calico on the shelf in her room, which had ceased being a storage space and become, somewhere in the accumulated days, simply the place where she slept and kept her things. And she went back to the kitchen and started on supper. And from the main room she could hear Lucy explaining her drawing to Ethan in considerable detail. And from upstairs she could hear Rose moving around in that unhurried teenage way that meant she was getting ready for something without urgency. And the stove was warm and the window was solid in its repaired frame. And outside the hills along Pinto Creek went dark in the early winter evening. She was still there. She was still here. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, the word here meant something specific. A place she had chosen and been chosen by in return. Imperfectly and without guarantees, which was the only way anything real ever happened. She cut the potatoes. The lamp burned. Somewhere above the fireplace, drying in the warm air of the main room, a small drawing of a house with an open gate waited to be hung. The blue calico dress took her 3 evenings to finish. She cut it on a Monday, pinned it on a Tuesday, and sewed it through Wednesday and into Thursday morning, working by lamplight after the girls were in bed with the particular focused quiet that sewing required. The needle moving, the fabric turning under her hands, the small, precise decisions that accumulated into something whole. She was not making it for any occasion. She made it because the fabric was good, and because Ida had been right about the color, and because making something from nothing was still, after all these years, the activity that most reliably made her feel that she was in the right relationship with the world. She hung it on the back of the door in her room and looked at it and thought, there, that was all, just there. She wore it to market on Sunday. Ethan brought the wagon around at 8, and Lucy was already in the back before anyone else had finished breakfast, and Rose came out in her good coat with her hair done in the way she'd recently started doing it, looser than the practical braid, something she had worked out from a pattern in one of Ida's catalogs. And then Clara came out in the blue dress with her coat over it, and Ethan looked at her from the wagon bench with an expression that stayed carefully neutral. But he looked at her for a full second longer than necessary before he looked away, which Clara noted and filed without comment. The market square in Black Ridge on the last Sunday of December looked nothing like it had the day Clara arrived. Or rather, it looked exactly the same. The same stalls, the same boardwalks, the same frozen mud at the edges of the road. But the light had changed, the way light changes in winter, and Clara was standing in a different part of it than she had been standing in before. She was standing with Ethan and the girls. That was the thing. That was the entire difference, and also it was not a small difference at all. They moved through this market together in the way of a family that has found its working arrangement. Ethan stopping at the feed merchant, Rose drifting toward Ida's window display, Lucy attached to Clara's side with the magnetic persistence she applied to anyone she had decided belonged to her. Clara bought thread and a paper of needles and a small jar of the particular salve Ida stocked that was useful for chapped hands in winter, which the Callaway Ranch produced in abundance. She spoke to the ranch wife who'd sent the coat for relining, who said it had held up beautifully through December and would likely see her through to spring. She spoke to Garrett the schoolteacher, who said Rose had made up nearly all of her missed work and would finish the term in good standing. Ordinary things. Ordinary Sunday morning things. Virgil Oates was behind his counter when she passed the dry goods store. He saw her through the window. She saw him see her. He gave a stiff nod, Not warm, not apologetic, just a nod. And she nodded back and kept walking, because she did not need anything from him except acknowledgement that she existed and was walking past his store on a Sunday morning with her coat over a blue dress and two girls in tow, which she was. Martha Pierce was harder. Clara saw her across the square, talking to one of the ranch wives near the fabric stall. Martha saw Clara at the same moment. There was a half second in which the two women looked at each other across the width of the market square on a cold December morning, and then Martha said something to the ranch wife and crossed the square toward them. Clara stopped walking. Lucy, still attached to her arm, stopped with her. Martha came to a halt a few feet away. She looked at Clara, and then at Lucy, and then at Clara again. "Miss Bennet," she said. "Mrs. Pierce," Clara said. A pause. Martha's expression moved through several things. The sharpness, the assessment. Something else underneath that was harder to name. She was a woman who had spent 30 years being certain she was right about most things, and certainty was a hard thing to dismantle even when the evidence pushed against it. "The Calloway girls are looking well," Martha said finally. "They are," Clara agreed. Another pause, this one longer. "I want you to know," Martha said, in a tone that cost her something, "that I was not intending to cause harm to the children." "I know," Clara said. "I stand by my concern," Martha continued, with some of her usual firmness returning. "I stand by the principle of it. A community has a right to ask questions about who is caring for its children." "A community does," Clara said. "Yes. But I may have—" Martha stopped, started again. "The manner in which I asked those questions may not have been— I may not have considered the full weight of what I was asking in that room. It was not an apology." Clara did not think Martha Pierce was physically capable of an apology in the traditional sense, but it was something. A woman in her 50s, who had been a force in this town for 3 decades, standing in a market square on a cold morning and saying "may have," which was as close to was wrong as her architecture allowed. "Mrs. Pierce," Clara said, "I grew up in a system where the people making decisions about children genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. That didn't always make them right, but it mattered that they believed it." She looked at her steadily. "I don't think you're a bad person." Martha held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at Lucy, who had been observing this exchange with the focused, unblinking attention of a 5-year-old who knows something important is happening, even if the specifics are unclear. "Hello, Lucy," Martha said. "Hello," said Lucy. "Your hat has a bird on it." "It does," Martha said. "Is it real?" "It is not." Lucy considered this. "That's probably better for the bird," she said, and then pulled on Clara's arm to indicate she was ready to move on, and they moved on, and Clara did not look back. She found Ethan at the wagon at 10:15. He was loading a sack of grain, and he looked up when she came around the back, and he saw her face, whatever was in it, and said, "Martha?" "We spoke," Clara said. "How was it?" "Fine," she said. It was fine. He looked at her a moment longer. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And she was. She was genuinely, specifically all right, which was different from the managed okayness she had been operating on for much of her adult life. She was all right the way a thing is all right when it has been tested and held. They drove home in the early afternoon, the 4 of them on the wagon bench and in the back, the winter hills pale gold where the sun hit them and dark brown in the shadows, and the Pinto Creek Road unrolled ahead of them in the particular quiet way it did when you knew where it led. The New Year came without ceremony, as New Year's tend to on working ranches where the animals require the same attention on January 1st as they do on every other day. But something in the first weeks of January felt different, a kind of settling, the way a house settles after it's been repaired. The acute drama of the custody hearing had passed. The waiting was over. What was left was just the daily work of being a household, which was enormous and ordinary and endless, and Clara was finding the best kind of work there was. She had been at the Calloway Ranch for 2.5 months. It was Ethan who brought it up, one evening in the second week of January, in the kitchen after supper while the girls were upstairs and the lamp was burning between them on the table. "I've been thinking," he said. "All right," she said. She was mending a split seam in Rose's school coat, and she kept her eyes on it because Ethan talked more freely when he wasn't being looked at directly. She had learned this. About what I said on the porch, he said, before Christmas.
What about it? I didn't say it well. You said it well enough, she said. She had said this before. I want to say it better. He was quiet for a moment. I've been trying to work out how. She set the coat down and looked at him. He was looking at his hands on the table, the way he did when he was working through something.
His hands were a working man's hands, scarred at the knuckles, the skin dry from cold and work, the kind of hands that told you what a person had spent their years doing. I was not a good husband at the end, he said. I need you to know that. Eleanor was sick for 8 months before she died, and I was there in the body and not always in the rest. I was scared, and I handled it by working more than was necessary and by being absent in ways that didn't show from the outside. He paused. Rose knows. She doesn't say it, but she knows. Clara waited. I'm telling you because I don't want to do that again, he said. I don't want to be the kind of man who doesn't say what he means until it's too late to say it. He looked up. So I'm going to say it plainly, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. All right, she said. I love you, he said. Not as an employee, not as the person who fixed the fence and the window and got Rose back to school, though those things matter. I love you because you're the most honest person I've ever been in a room with, and you're not gentle about things, but you're not cruel either, and you make this place feel like what I always hoped it would be. He stopped. That's what I should have said on the porch. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the places she had not been able to stay. The boarding house in Millvale, the succession of short-term situations, the permanent temporary quality of a life built on the assumption that nothing was going to last. She thought about learning, very early and very thoroughly, not to let herself want things that could be taken away. She thought about how long that had kept her safe and how much it had cost her. She thought about a 5-year-old in a barn doorway watching a gray colt learn to stand, and a 13-year-old at a kitchen table catching up on 7 months of school, and a man on a porch in December saying different when he meant something larger, and the blue calico dress on the back of the door, and an open gate in a child's drawing. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I want you to know that accurately, not in theory. I don't ask for help naturally. I get stubborn about the wrong things. I keep accounts for money that isn't mine because I can't fully believe yet that I'm not going to have to leave, and I've been sleeping in that back room for 2 months still waiting for something to go wrong. She held his gaze. That's what you'd be taking on. I know, he said. You've been watching me for 2 months. You know some of it, not all of it. I know enough to know I want to know the rest, he said. Clara took a breath. I love you too, she said, simply. The way she had said the true things in the courthouse, without decoration, because decoration was what you added when you weren't sure the thing itself was enough, and she was sure. I have for a while. I've been not looking at it because I've learned that looking at things too directly makes them feel less stable. Does it feel stable now? He asked. She considered this honestly. It feels like the most stable thing I've had since I was 12 years old, sitting in a kitchen garden, learning how to put up tomatoes, she said, which is not nothing. His mouth did the thing, the almost smile, and this time it didn't stop at almost. She had not, she realized, seen him actually smile before. Not fully. It changed his face in a way that she registered in her chest. I want to marry you, he said. I'm not asking tonight. I know that's too fast. But I'm telling you because I said I'd say things plainly. You could ask tonight, she said. He looked at her. I've been making decisions about where I'm going to be since I was 16 years old, Clara said. I know my own mind. Clara, ask me, she said. A pause. A real pause. The kind where a person is checking whether what they are about to do is actually what they mean to do, which is the right kind of checking. Will you marry me? He said. Yes, she said. Obviously. He laughed then, a real one, surprised out of him, the laugh of a man who has not laughed genuinely and long enough that it sounds a little rusty. And Clara smiled, which was also not something she did effortlessly, and the lamp burned between them on the kitchen table of a ranch house on Pinto Creek in the frontier, 2 imperfect people who had come to each other sideways and by accident, and had decided, without elegance and without particular confidence, but with absolute seriousness, to stay. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. They both looked at the ceiling. Rose, Ethan said. She's been up there for at least 20 minutes, Clara said. That board is right outside the top of the stairs? A silence from above. Rose, Ethan said, louder. A longer silence. Then footsteps. Rose appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, her hair loose, her face wearing the expression of someone who was caught and was attempting to reconstruct dignity from available materials. I was getting water, she said. The water is in the kitchen, Ethan said. I was going to come down for it. Were you? A pause. Rose looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. Whatever Rose had overheard, whatever she had been standing at the top of the stairs listening to, was in her face now. Not as shock, but as something she had perhaps, in some private part of herself, been waiting for. Are you going to be our mother? She asked Clara. The directness of it, the stripped-down directness of a 13-year-old asking the only question that actually mattered, sat in the kitchen for a moment. No, Clara said. Your mother was your mother, and I'm not that. I'm not trying to be that. She paused. But I'm going to be here. I'm going to be here for a very long time, and whatever that makes me to you, whatever word fits, I'll take it. Rose stood on the stairs for a moment. Then she came down, walked to the kitchen, took a cup of water from the pitcher, drank half of it, set it down, looked at Clara, and said, Okay. Okay, Clara said. I'm going back to bed, Rose said. Good night, Rose, Ethan said. Don't stay up too late, Rose said, with the authority of someone who has spent 13 years managing other people's sleep schedules, and went back upstairs. They heard her door close. Then, after a moment, what might have been, just barely, a sound that a 13-year-old girl would make in the privacy of her room when something happened that she had been half hoping for and had not let herself believe would come. Clara and Ethan sat in the kitchen with the lamp between them and said nothing for a while. There was nothing that needed saying. The house held them. The repaired window, the solid roof, the full pantry, the drawing on the wall above the fireplace that Lucy had insisted on hanging herself with 2 nails she'd driven in with a concentration that suggested she considered it a matter of permanent record. 4 figures. An open gate. The thick crayon strokes of a 5-year-old who knew what home looked like and had decided to document it. They married in March. It was not an elaborate wedding. Clara had not expected one and did not want one. Elaborate had never been available to her, and she had never developed a taste for it. They went into town on a Tuesday morning, all 4 of them, and stood in front of Justice of the Peace Aldridge, who was a mild man of 70 who performed these ceremonies with the brisk efficiency of someone who has married enough frontier couples to know that the paperwork matters more than the occasion. Ida Marsh stood as witness. Garrett, the schoolteacher, stood as the second. Lucy wore a ribbon in her hair that she had been lobbying for since January, and Rose stood beside her father with the particular tall, formal posture of a girl taking something seriously. Clara wore the blue calico dress. The ceremony took 11 minutes. She signed her name, Clara Bennett, for the last time. And then Ethan signed his, and Aldridge said the relevant words, and that was that. They shook hands with Aldridge and Garrett, and Ida hugged Clara briefly and fiercely and said good, in a tone that seemed to contain a great deal more than one word usually held, and Lucy immediately began calling Clara Mama Clara, which she had apparently been rehearsing for some time, given how readily it arrived, and Rose said nothing but stood close to Clara on the boardwalk in a way that was its own language. They went to Grady's for a meal afterward, a real meal, the kind that cost more than they usually spent on a Tuesday, and they sat in the front room of the meal house and ate properly, and Ethan ordered pie for everyone without being asked, which Clara noted was a departure from his usual economy and was therefore significant. The meal house was half full of the ordinary Tuesday crowd, and people looked at them, and some of them nodded, and some of them talked among themselves. And one of the older ranch wives, a woman Clara didn't know well, stopped at their table on her way out and said to Clara, "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway," with a warmth that seemed uncomplicated and genuine. And Clara said thank you, and the woman left, and Clara sat with the name for a moment. Mrs. Calloway. She tried it on the way you try on something unfamiliar, turning it, checking the fit, seeing how it felt to occupy it. It felt strange, and also not strange at all, which was probably the right feeling. Spring came to the Pinto Creek Ranch in the slow, muddy, incremental way that spring comes to the frontier. Not all at once, not gracefully, but in degrees. The thaw turned the yard to mud for 2 weeks before the ground firmed up. The cattle that had been wintered in the lower pasture came back up to the upper ranges, thin but sound. The kitchen garden, which Clara had laid out in the fall and Ethan had broken ground for in early March, was planted through April in stages, cold, hardy things first, then the rest as the soil warmed. Lucy planted 2 rows of beans herself and visited them every morning to check for progress with the grave dedication of a scientist awaiting data. "They're not doing anything," she reported on the 5th day. "They're doing things underground," Clara said. "How do you know?" "Because that's how beans work. They make their roots first." Lucy crouched down and looked at the soil. "Hello," she said to it. Then she stood up and went back inside, apparently satisfied that she had done her part. Rose finished the school term in 3rd position overall, which Garrett reported with a particular emphasis that communicated both pride in the student and awareness of what the year had required of her. She came home with her grades paper and put it on the kitchen table without saying anything, and Ethan picked it up and read it and looked at her, and Rose looked at him, and something passed between a father and a daughter that Clara watched from the doorway without entering, because some moments belonged to people in a particular combination and required everyone else to stay outside. Later, Rose found her in the garden. "Garrett said if I keep at the arithmetic, he'll advance me to the senior curriculum in the fall," she said. "That's good news," Clara said. "He also said he might need help with the younger students next term." Rose paused. "Not paid, just help." "You should do it," Clara said. "I know," Rose said, in the tone of someone who has already decided and is doing the courtesy of announcing it. She was going to be fine, Clara thought, more than fine. She was going to be someone that people would find immovable and would eventually be grateful for it. The Eastern grazing permit came through in April. Ethan heard the news on a Thursday and came in from town with it and sat at the kitchen table and put the paper down in front of Clara and said nothing, just sat there, and Clara read it and looked at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "when do we bring in the additional stock?" "June," he said. "I've been talking to the Hendersons about purchasing part of their herd. They're looking to reduce. Can we carry them through next winter? With the upper pasture and the new permit, yes," he paused. "We're going to need another pair of hands through the summer." "The Henderson boy," Clara said, "the one you mentioned in December." "Tommy Henderson, yes. He's 17 and looking for work." "Is he reliable?" "His father says so." "His father would," Clara said. Ethan almost smiled. "I'll find out for myself." This was how they talked, she and Ethan, in the months after the wedding, in the practical, slightly abbreviated shorthand of 2 people who have been paying close attention to each other for long enough to skip the intermediate steps. It was not romantic in any particular way. It was something better than romantic. It was the conversation of 2 people who had figured out that they were on the same side of things and were proceeding accordingly. She loved him. She loved him in the specific, unsentimental way she did most things, not with performance or declaration, but with the daily accumulation of small choices in his direction. The way she learned which things he needed to be left alone with and which ones he needed company for. The way she started his coffee before he was dressed in the morning because she was always up first and the small act cost nothing and mattered to him. The way she said, when he came in tired and didn't want to talk, "Eat and go to bed," without making him explain why. He loved her back in the same currency. He fixed the door of her room without being asked, properly fixed it so it closed squarely, which it had never done in all the months she'd been there. He made a point, on market Sundays, of walking beside her through the square, rather than ahead, in the way of a man who has thought about what he is communicating with his body in a public place. He asked her opinions on the ranch decisions not as a courtesy, but as a genuine inquiry, and he changed his mind when she was right without making it into a thing. They were not perfect together. She burned dinners sometimes, still, and got stubborn about the wrong things, still, and there were evenings when the old habit of not needing anyone pressed up against the daily fact of needing these people, and it made her difficult in ways she couldn't always explain, and Ethan would give her the space she didn't ask for, and she would come back from it, and they would both go on. He had his own habits. The way he disappeared into work when something scared him. The way he held grief like a private property he was reluctant to share, and she learned to sit near those things without requiring him to hand them to her all at once. They worked at each other, that was the honest word for it. Not effortlessly, not naturally, but with intention and patience and the accumulated evidence that the working was worth the effort. On a Sunday morning in early May, Clara was in the kitchen garden when she heard the gate. The creak of it, the particular sound it made, and she looked up and saw a woman coming down the path from the road. Older, unfamiliar, traveling alone. The woman stopped a few feet from the garden. She was perhaps 60, with a careful measuring face and clothes that said town rather than ranch. "Good morning," she said. "I'm looking for the Calloway Ranch." "You found it," Clara said. The woman looked at her. "You're Mrs. Calloway." "I am," Clara said. The name still required a moment, a small internal adjustment, but she made it. "Can I help you?" "My name is Vera Holt," the woman said. "I'm a welfare representative from the county. I've been asked to do a follow-up visit. Standard process after a custody ruling." She paused. "I don't want to cause any alarm, it's simply procedure." "Come in," Claire said. "I'll put coffee on." She brought the woman inside and Ethan came in from the barn, and the girls were called down from upstairs. Rose came with her hair loose and a book in her hand. Lucy came at a run and immediately asked Vera Holt whether she wanted to see the beans she had planted. And Vera said she would very much like to see the beans, and Lucy took her by the hand and led her to the kitchen garden. Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched the welfare representative crouch down beside Lucy in the garden, listening to a 5-year-old explain the underground activities of beans with complete seriousness. And she thought about how strange life was. Not in a literary way, not reaching for a grand observation, just in the plain way that it genuinely was strange. How many specific things had to happen in a specific order to arrive at this particular Tuesday morning, with the garden in bloom, and the house in order, and a child explaining beans to a stranger in the yard? She had been driven out of this town. She had been publicly declared a problem and given until 2:30 to board a stagecoach and become someone else's question. She had been dissected in a courtroom by a careful woman with a reasonable concern and a partial picture. She had been all of those things, and she was also here, in this kitchen, with coffee on the stove, watching her daughter. She thought the word plainly now, let it sit. Watching her daughter conduct a tour of a kitchen garden. Vera Holt wrote in her notebook for a while. She spoke with Ethan, with Rose, briefly and cheerfully with Lucy, who told her everything about everything, including Button the absent colt. She walked through the house with the professional attention of her role, and Clara walked beside her without anxiety, because the house was what it was, and she had built it into what it was, and there was nothing in it she needed to conceal. At the end of her visit, Vera sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked at Clara directly. "I'm going to be blunt with you, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "I've done a great many of these follow-up visits. In a surprising number of cases, the households that were fighting hardest to stay together are the ones that have come apart by the time I get there." She paused. "This is not that." "No," Clara said, "it isn't. Whatever you've built here." Vera looked around the kitchen, at the organized shelves, at the window that fit squarely in its frame, at the drawing above the fireplace. "It's solid. We worked at it," Clara said. "I can see that." The woman picked up her coffee. "The drawing," she said, nodding toward the fireplace. "That the younger girl's work?" "Lucy's," Claire said. "She hung it herself, 2 nails." Vera looked at it for a moment. The 4 figures, the open gate, the crayon lines that were imprecise and absolutely certain at the same time. "The gate's open," she said. "She says it means more people can come in," Clara said. Vera smiled. "Smart kid." "She really is," Clara said. Vera finished her coffee and collected her things and shook hands with Ethan at the door and told them she would file her report within the week and that they should not expect to hear further from the county unless there was cause, which she did not anticipate. The buggy went back down the Pinto Creek Road, and the gate swung closed behind it, and the ranch was quiet, in the way it was quiet on May mornings when the work of the day had not yet fully assembled itself. Ethan stood beside Clara at the gate. "That's the last of it," he said. "The formal part." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what I thought," he said, "that day in the market square? When you were sitting on the boardwalk and everyone was just—" He made a gesture. "Standing there?" "What?" she said.
I thought she's the only one who moved. He looked at her. Everyone in that square froze.
100 people, and one woman got up and moved toward the problem. And then she sat down afterward, and she didn't look proud, and she didn't look scared. She just looked tired, Clara said. Present, he said. She looked completely present. He paused. I don't know what I expected from that. I just paid your debt and asked if you needed work because it seemed like what the situation called for. That's all I was hoping for, she said. Something the situation called for. And now? He said. She looked at the ranch, at the kitchen garden and the repaired fence and the barn with its tarred roof and the house with the drawing above the fireplace, at Rose's bedroom window where she could see the edge of the desk she'd cleaned up from the barn and installed there, at the yard where Lucy was currently attempting to convince one of the barn cats to participate in an activity that the cat was visibly reluctant about. She thought about belonging, about how she had spent 20 years believing it was something you either had or you didn't, something issued to people at birth along with family and name and a fixed place in the world. She had not had those things, and so she had concluded, with the logic of a child who has been given no alternative explanation, that belonging was not for her. What she knew now, what these months had taught her, in the unglamorous, incremental way that real things get taught, was that belonging was not issued. It was built. It was built the way a house was built, the way a fence was built, the way a relationship between a woman and a suspicious 13-year-old was built. One decision at a time, one morning at a time, one repaired window and one walk to school and one honest word at a time. It was not finished. It would never be finished. That was not a flaw in the design. That was the design. Now, she said, I live here. He put his arm around her, which he did not do often in the open yard, and she leaned against him for a moment, which she did not do easily, and they stood at the gate of the Callaway Ranch on a May morning while their daughters occupied themselves in the way of daughters everywhere, one at a desk with a book, one in a yard with a cat, and the Pinto Creek Road went west toward town and east toward the open range, and the sky above the hills was the particular blue that made you understand why people had always come to the frontier looking for something they couldn't name. Lucy gave up on the cat and came across the yard to them. She looked up at her father and Clara with the considering expression of a 5-year-old calibrating a situation. Are you being happy? She asked. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. Yes, Ethan said. Good, Lucy said. I'm going to check my beans. And she went to the garden, crouched down, said something to the soil that they couldn't hear from the gate, and stood back up apparently satisfied. Clara watched her. She thought, this is not a perfect life. The cattle would get sick some years. The money would be tight more years than not. Rose would leave eventually, as children leave, and that would be its own particular grief mixed with pride. Lucy would grow up and become someone neither of them could fully predict. There would be bad winters and bad seasons, and the ordinary accumulation of difficulty that made up a life in the frontier, or anywhere. Ethan would disappear into his work when things scared him, and she would get stubborn at the wrong moments, and neither of them would always know the right word for what they meant. The town would move on, and some of the people in it would remember the market square and some wouldn't, and Martha Pierce would remain Martha Pierce, which was not the worst thing in the world. None of that had been fixed. You didn't fix a life. You lived in it. And Clara Bennett, Clara Callaway, had spent 24 years learning in the most expensive possible school exactly what it cost to not have a life to live in. She was not going to waste the one she'd found. The morning went on. The work assembled itself, the way work did. Ethan went back to the barn and Rose called down from her window about something she needed for school, and Clara answered her and went inside. And above the fireplace, Lucy's drawing hung where it had been all winter, the crayon line still bright, the 4 figures still standing, the gate still open. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, not one of them was leaving. They were, simply, wholly and without reservation, home.